Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. In this video, we embark on a calm journey toward one of history's greatest mysteries, the lost city of Atlantis, a civilization spoken of in whispers across thousands of years, a place that might have existed beyond the pillars of the known world, or perhaps only in the imagination of ancient minds. Atlantis has captured human curiosity since the time of ancient Athens, and tonight we will explore every quiet detail of this legendary tale. Relax, close your eyes, and let us drift into the story. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The story of Atlantis begins not in the depths of the ocean, but in the heart of ancient Athens, around the year 360 before the Common Era. The city is alive with the sound of sandals on the stone streets, the murmur of philosophers gathered in the agora, and the soft rustling of papyrus scrolls being unrolled in sunlit courtyards. It is here, in this world of marble columns and olive groves, that a man named Plato sits with his students, speaking of things both real and imagined. Plato is not young anymore. His beard has grown long and gray, and his eyes carry the weight of decades spent thinking about justice, truth, and the nature of reality itself. He has already written many dialogues, conversations between his teacher Socrates and various Athenians, exploring questions that have no easy answers. But now, in his later years, he writes something different. He writes about a place that existed long before Athens, long before Greece itself had taken the shape familiar to his contemporaries. He writes about Atlantis. The account comes to us through two of Plato's dialogues. The first is called Timaeus, and the second, which was never finished, is called Critias. In these texts, Plato does not speak in his own voice. Instead, he lets his characters tell the story, as if they heard it from someone else, who heard it from someone else before them. This chain of storytelling reaches back through generations, like a whisper traveling through time. The tale, as Plato presents it, begins with Solon, one of Athens' great lawgivers, who lived about 200 years before Plato's time. Solon was not just a politician. He was a poet, a traveler, and a man hungry for knowledge. Around the year 590 before the Common Era, Solon journeys to Egypt, to the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Egypt, at this time, is already impossibly old. Its pyramids have stood for over 2,000 years. Its temples hold records stretching back into ages the Greeks can barely imagine. In Sais, Solon meets with Egyptian priests. These are men who guard the sacred knowledge of their civilization, keepers of records inscribed on temple walls and stored in scrolls within cool, shadowed libraries. The Greeks, for all their philosophy and art, are young in the eyes of these priests. One of them, an elderly man whose name has not survived the centuries, tells Solon something remarkable. He says that the Greeks are like children. They have no deep memory. Every few generations, catastrophe strikes, whether flood or fire or plague, and their records are lost. They must begin again, forgetting what came before. But Egypt, protected by the Nile and blessed by geography, has preserved its memory. And in that memory, there is a story of Athens itself, an Athens that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, an Athens that fought against a great empire that rose from beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules. Today we call this place the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage where the Mediterranean Sea opens into the vast Atlantic Ocean. To the ancient Greeks, this was the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay mystery, danger, and the endless expanse of water that stretched toward nothing. But according to the Egyptian priest, beyond those pillars, there was once an island, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. This island was called Atlantis. Imagine for a moment what Solon must have felt, sitting in that Egyptian temple, listening to this story. The air is heavy with incense. Light filters through high windows, casting long beams across hieroglyphics that spiral up stone columns. The priest's voice is steady, calm, as if he is reciting something as certain as the sunrise. And in that voice, a lost world begins to take shape. Atlantis, the priest explains, was not just an island. It was the heart of a mighty empire. The Atlanteans controlled not only their own land, but also parts of the continent beyond, and many islands in the great ocean. They reached across the sea and seized territories in the Mediterranean as well, pressing as far as Egypt in one direction and Tyrrhenia in the other. This was an empire of immense power, and it sought to enslave all the lands within the Pillars of Hercules. But they met resistance. Ancient Athens, the Athens of 9,000 years past, stood against them. This ancient city was not the Athens Solon knew. It was older, its people shaped by different gods and different customs. Yet they possessed courage and excellence in war. When the Atlantean forces pressed forward, threatening to overwhelm the entire Mediterranean world, it was Athens that organized the resistance. The Athenians fought with valor that seemed almost superhuman, and in the end they drove back the invaders. Yet victory did not mean survival for Atlantis. In a single day and night of catastrophe, the island was swallowed by the sea. Earthquakes shook the earth, waves rose higher than mountains, and the entire civilization vanished beneath the waters. Where there had been palaces and temples, there was now only ocean. Where there had been gardens and harbors, there was only the slow drifting of fish through empty spaces. The Athenian warriors who had fought so bravely also perished, swept away in the same cataclysm that destroyed their enemies. This is the story Solon heard. He brought it back to Athens, writing it down in verse, intending to make it into an epic poem. But he never finished the work. Instead, the story passed from Solon to his relatives, and from them through the generations, until it reached Plato's family. And Plato, recognizing something valuable in the tale, wove it into his philosophical dialogues. Now, as you listen to this, perhaps lying in the darkness of your room, you might wonder what to make of such a story. Is it history or invention? Did Atlantis truly exist, a real place swallowed by the sea? Or was it only a creation of Plato's imagination, a tool to illustrate his ideas about the ideal state and the dangers of hubris? Scholars have debated this question for over 2,000 years. Some insist that every detail Plato provides suggests he is describing a real place, drawing on genuine ancient records preserved in Egypt. Others argue that the entire account is allegory, a moral lesson dressed in the clothing of history. Plato often used myths and stories to convey deeper truths. Perhaps Atlantis was never meant to be believed as literal fact, but rather as a thought experiment, a way to explore what makes a society great and what causes it to fall. Let us sit with this uncertainty for a moment. The story of Atlantis exists in a strange space between history and legend, between memory and imagination. It is neither entirely one nor entirely the other. And perhaps that is why it has endured for so long. It invites us to wonder, to search, to dream of lost worlds beneath the waves. As the night deepens around you, think of Solon in that Egyptian temple, listening to the priest's calm recitation. Think of Plato in his garden, writing by lamplight, crafting sentences that would echo through millennia. Think of the countless people who have heard this story since, who have looked out over the ocean and wondered what might lie beneath. In the dialogues, Plato provides more than just a tale of war and destruction. He describes Atlantis itself, giving details of its geography, its buildings, its way of life. These descriptions are specific, almost too specific for pure invention. He tells of a circular island with rings of water and land alternating around a central hill. He speaks of canals and bridges, of walls covered in precious metals, of temples dedicated to the sea god Poseidon. He describes the Atlantean government, their customs, their wealth, and eventually their moral decay. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore the civilization itself, let us linger here in this beginning, in the moment when the story first enters written record. There is something peaceful about origins, about tracing a thing back to its source. The Atlantis we know comes from Plato, but Plato claims it comes from Solon, and Solon from the Egyptian priests, and they from records older still. Each link in this chain adds distance, adds mystery, adds the soft blur of time. As you rest now, imagine those Egyptian temples where the priests kept their records. The walls are covered in painted reliefs, showing gods and pharaohs, festivals and battles. Scrolls are stored in clay jars, each one carefully labeled, each one containing fragments of the past. The priests move slowly through these archives, their footsteps echoing in stone corridors. They are the keepers of memory in a world where memory is fragile, where it can be washed away by flood, or burned by fire, or simply forgotten in the chaos of war. When Solon visits, they recognize in him a kindred spirit, a man who values knowledge and wants to preserve it. And so they share what they know. They tell him of the world before, of civilizations that rose and fell, of Athens itself, in an age so distant it seems like another world entirely. And they tell him of Atlantis, the great antagonist in an ancient struggle, the empire that reached too far and fell into the abyss. Solon listens, and in his listening the story survives. It travels from Egypt to Athens, from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, until it reaches Plato. And Plato, rather than letting it fade into obscurity, writes it down. He gives it permanence, inscribing it on papyrus that will be copied and recopied, translated into Latin, Arabic, and eventually into every major language of the world. In doing so, Plato does not just preserve a story. He creates a legend that will obsess humanity for thousands of years. There is something deeply human about this obsession. We are drawn to the idea of lost civilizations, of golden ages that slipped away. We want to believe that somewhere in the past there existed something grander than what we know now. And we want to believe that traces of it might still be found, waiting beneath the ocean's surface, waiting to be discovered. But for now, let us stay in this ancient beginning. Let us rest in the world of Plato and Solon, in the world of Egyptian priests and sunlit courtyards. The story has been set in motion. The seed has been planted. And as you close your eyes and feel sleep approaching, you can sense the story beginning to grow, spreading across centuries, reaching toward you through the vast expanse of time. Tomorrow, in the next part of our journey, we will explore the civilization itself, the daily life of Atlantis, as Plato described it. But tonight, we end here, at the source, at the moment when a legend is born. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts drift. The ancient world is far away now, fading into the comfortable darkness of sleep. And somewhere, in the depths of history, Atlantis waits. The sun rises slowly over the island of Atlantis. Light spreads across the water first, turning the ocean from black to deep blue, then to a brilliant turquoise as it catches the shallow areas near the coast. The island sits in the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a place where the sea stretches endlessly in all directions. But this island is not small. According to Plato's account, it is vast, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a landmass that supports millions of people and holds within it riches beyond imagination. Let us walk through this place together slowly, taking in every detail. There is no need to hurry. Time moves differently here, in this world that exists only in ancient texts and human imagination. We will explore the city at the heart of Atlantis, the capital that Plato describes with such precision that scholars have spent lifetimes trying to reconstruct it from his words alone. The geography of Atlantis is unusual, almost artificial in its symmetry. At the center of the island is a low mountain, a hill really, where the first settlers made their home. This hill becomes the sacred center of the entire civilization. Around it, the Atlanteans constructed a series of alternating rings, circles of water and circles of land, each one separated from the next. There are 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land encircling the central island, creating a pattern that looks, from above, like a target or the ripples on a pond frozen in place. These rings are not natural. They were carved by human hands, or rather, according to the legend, by the god Poseidon himself when he first claimed this island for his dwelling place. Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. She lived on this hill at the center of what would become Atlantis. To protect her, Poseidon broke the land and carved these defensive rings, isolating the central hill so that no human could reach it easily. There, in this protected sanctuary, Cleito bore Poseidon 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 princes who would become the first rulers of Atlantis. But over time, what Poseidon created as a simple protection grew into something far more elaborate. The descendants of those first princes, the Atlanteans, were engineers and architects of remarkable skill. They transformed the rings into a functioning city, adding bridges and tunnels, harbors and canals. They covered the walls with metals. They built temples and palaces. They created a civilization that, according to Plato, surpassed anything the ancient world had ever known. Imagine standing on the outermost ring of land. The morning is cool, and a gentle breeze comes off the ocean, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. Before you stretches one of the great canals that the Atlanteans dug to connect their circular city to the sea. This canal is wide enough for large ships to pass through, and deep enough that even the greatest vessels can navigate it without difficulty. It runs in a straight line from the outermost ring all the way to the coast, a distance of about 50 stads, roughly 6 miles, cutting through the island's landscape like a highway of water. Ships are already moving along this canal even in the early morning. There are trading vessels with their holds full of goods from distant lands, warships with their rows of oars, striking the water in perfect rhythm, fishing boats returning from a night at sea with their catches. The Atlanteans are a maritime people. The ocean is their road, their protection, and their source of wealth. Everything about their civilization reflects this relationship with the sea. As you walk along the canal toward the city center, you pass through zones dedicated to different activities. Here, near the outer edges, are the farms and fields that feed the population. The land is extraordinarily fertile, Plato tells us. The climate is mild, the soil rich, and the Atlanteans have become masters of irrigation, channeling water from the rings and canals to nourish their crops. They grow grain and vegetables. They tend orchards of fruit trees. They raise cattle and sheep in wide pastures. The island produces more food than its people can consume, and the surplus becomes another source of wealth, exported to other lands in exchange for goods Atlantis lacks. The outer ring of land is also home to the common people, the farmers and craftsmen, the sailors and merchants who keep the civilization running, but do not possess great wealth or noble blood. Their homes are simple, made of stone or sun-dried brick, with flat roofs where families gather in the evening to escape the heat of the day. Life here is not glamorous, but it is comfortable. Atlantis is a rich nation, and even its common citizens enjoy a standard of living that would be the envy of many kingdoms. You continue inward, crossing a bridge that spans the first ring of water. This ring is not natural. It is a moat, a defensive barrier, but it serves many other purposes as well. The water is clean and clear, fed by underground springs and by channels that connect it to the sea. Boats move along its surface, ferrying people and goods from one part of the city to another. Children play along its banks, and fishermen sit with their lines, waiting patiently for a bite. The second ring of land is more densely populated. Here the homes are larger, built of better materials. Stone gives way to marble. Simple construction gives way to columns and courtyards. This is where the merchant class lives, the wealthy traders and shipowners, the master craftsmen whose skills bring them prosperity. The streets are wider here, paved with stones that fit together so precisely that you can barely see the seams. There are shops selling goods from across the known world: Egyptian papyrus, Greek olive oil, precious stones from distant mines, textiles dyed in colors so vibrant they seem to glow. As you walk these streets, you hear a dozen different languages being spoken, Atlantis is an empire, and its capital is a cosmopolitan place where people from many lands come to trade, to learn, to seek their fortunes. There are Greeks and Egyptians. There are dark-skinned merchants from the southern lands. There are pale traders from the north, where the sun barely rises in winter. They mingle in the markets. They argue over prices. They share stories of their homelands, while sitting in taverns that serve wine and beer, and strange drinks from places whose names you have never heard. Another bridge, another ring of water crossed. Now you approach the innermost ring of land, and here everything changes. This is not a place for common people. This is where the nobility lives, where the descendants of Poseidon's first sons maintain their palaces and gardens. The architecture here is breathtaking. Buildings rise 3 and 4 stories high, faced with white marble that gleams in the sunlight. Red stone and black stone are used as accents, creating patterns that please the eye. According to Plato, the Atlanteans covered many of these buildings in metals. The outer walls were coated with brass, which flashed like fire when the sun hit it. Inner walls were covered with tin, and the innermost sanctuaries, the most sacred spaces, were sheathed in orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato says was mined from the earth in many parts of the island. Orichalcum, he tells us, was second only to gold in value, and it gave off a red light, glowing as if it were alive. What was orichalcum? No one knows for certain. The word itself means mountain copper in Greek, but the metal Plato describes seems to be something more than ordinary copper. Some scholars think it might have been a special bronze alloy. Others suggest it was amber or some other substance entirely. Like so much about Atlantis, orichalcum exists in a realm of uncertainty, a mystery that adds to the legend's allure. But standing here on the inner ring, looking at these glowing walls, you do not need to understand what orichalcum truly was. You only need to see how it transformed the city into something magical, something that seemed to belong to the gods rather than to mortals. The light reflecting off these metal-covered walls creates an atmosphere of wealth and power, a visual statement that this civilization—
At the very center, across the final ring of water, stands the citadel, the heart of Atlantis. This is the hill where Plato once lived, where Poseidon carved out a sanctuary for his beloved. Now it is home to the greatest temple in all the island, the temple of Poseidon himself. To reach it, you must cross a final bridge, and as you do, you feel the weight of the place, the centuries of history and devotion that have soaked into the stones. The temple is enormous. Plato gives us its dimensions: 1 stade in length, which is about 600 feet, half a stade in width, and of a height proportional to these measurements. The exterior is covered entirely in silver except for the statues on the roof, which are gold. The roof itself is made of ivory, decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum in intricate patterns. Even before you enter, the temple overwhelms the senses with its richness, its sheer scale, its declaration that here dwells a god. Inside, the temple is even more astonishing. The ceiling is carved from ivory and painted in colors that have remained bright despite the passage of time. Gold is everywhere, covering columns and walls, catching the light from hundreds of oil lamps that burn perpetually in the god's honor. At the center of the temple stands a statue of Poseidon so large that his head nearly touches the ceiling. The god is shown standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, and around him are 100 nereids, the sea nymphs riding on dolphins. The statue is made of gold and ivory, worked by the finest craftsmen Atlantis can produce, and it radiates power and majesty. People come to this temple every day to offer prayers and sacrifices. In the morning, you might see priests in their ceremonial robes leading oxen toward the altar. These are not ordinary cattle. According to Plato, bulls are sacred to Poseidon, and the kings of Atlantis perform special rituals involving them. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings who rule the different regions of the Atlantean Empire gather here in the temple. They hunt bulls that are allowed to roam freely within the sacred precinct, but they use no weapons of iron or steel, only wooden clubs and ropes of woven hemp. When they capture a bull, they lead it to a pillar inscribed with the laws of Atlantis, laws established by Poseidon himself in the beginning. There they sacrifice the bull, letting its blood flow over the inscriptions, renewing their oath to govern justly and to maintain the principles on which their civilization was founded. After the sacrifice, the kings hold council. They judge any disputes between the regions. They discuss matters of war and peace. They ensure that the empire remains unified and strong. At night, they feast together, reaffirming their bonds of kinship and their shared descent from Poseidon. This is how Atlantis is governed, not by a single tyrant, but by a council of related kings who share power and responsibility. Beyond the temple, the citadel contains other important buildings. There are palaces for the kings, each one a masterwork of architecture with gardens and fountains, with rooms for hundreds of servants and guards. There are government buildings where scribes keep records of tax collections, trade agreements, military strength. There is a great library where the wisdom of the ages is preserved on scrolls and tablets. There are schools where the children of the elite learn mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and the arts of war. And there are the harbors. Plato describes these in particular detail, and they reveal much about what made Atlantis powerful. The harbors are not located at the city center, but along the outermost ring of water, connected to the sea by that great canal we walked along earlier. They are vast, capable of holding hundreds of ships. The Atlanteans have constructed covered shipyards where vessels can be built and repaired, protected from the weather. They have warehouses stacked high with goods waiting to be loaded or distributed. They have naval bases where warships are kept ready, maintained by crews who live in barracks nearby. The Atlantean Navy is formidable. Plato tells us that they could field 1,200 warships, each one manned by skilled sailors and marines. This naval power is how Atlantis built its empire, how it conquered islands across the ocean and territories on the continents beyond. The ships carry not just soldiers, but also the influence of Atlantean culture, spreading their language, their customs, their way of life to distant shores. Life in Atlantis follows rhythms established over generations. In the morning, the city comes alive with activity. Merchants open their shops, workers head to the shipyards or the fields. Children run through the streets on their way to school or to play. The canals fill with boats carrying goods and people. The markets buzz with voices raised in negotiation or greeting. Smoke rises from thousands of hearths as families prepare their morning meals. At midday, the pace slows. The sun is hot, especially in summer, and those who can afford it retreat indoors, seeking shade and cool drinks. The wealthy rest in their courtyards, perhaps listening to musicians or poets who perform for their entertainment. The common people find what shade they can, eating simple lunches of bread and cheese and olives while they talk about the day's work or share gossip about their neighbors. Afternoon brings a return to activity, but slower, more measured than the morning rush. This is when official business is often conducted, when the administrators of the empire review reports from distant provinces, when judges hear disputes, when teachers give their most important lectures. The light softens as the sun descends toward the western horizon, and the harsh glare gives way to a golden glow that makes the metal-covered buildings shine even more brilliantly. Evening is for gathering. Families come together for the main meal of the day. In wealthy homes, this might be an elaborate affair with multiple courses, with entertainment provided by slaves or hired performers. In humbler dwellings, it is simpler but no less important, a time when parents and children sit together and share the day's experiences. After eating, people often go out again. The streets remain busy well into the night. There are taverns and wine shops where men gather to drink and talk. There are theaters where plays are performed, retelling old myths or presenting new stories that comment on contemporary life. There are temples where evening prayers are offered, where the devout come to seek blessings or give thanks. The night in Atlantis is not entirely dark. Oil lamps burn in windows and along major streets. The wealthy can afford to keep their homes well lit, creating islands of brightness in the darkness. The temple of Poseidon blazes with light visible from anywhere in the city, a constant reminder of the god's presence and protection. Guards patrol the streets and the walls, ensuring that order is maintained, that the peace of the night is not disturbed. And then, as the night deepens, the city gradually falls quiet. One by one, the lights go out. Families settle into their beds. The streets empty except for the guards and the occasional late wanderer. The sound of the water in the rings becomes more noticeable in the silence, a gentle lapping against stone embankments. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere else a child cries briefly before being soothed back to sleep. The city breathes, resting, gathering strength for another day. This is Atlantis as Plato described it, a civilization of remarkable sophistication and wealth. But even in his description, there are hints of what is to come. He mentions that in the beginning, the Atlanteans were virtuous. They valued wisdom and moderation. They governed justly and treated other peoples with respect. But over time, something changed. The divine nature that flowed in their veins from their descent from Poseidon began to weaken, diluted by generations of intermarriage with mortals. Human nature, with all its flaws, began to dominate. The Atlanteans became proud. They began to value wealth and power more than virtue. They looked at their prosperity and believed they were invincible, that their empire would last forever. They grew ambitious, no longer content with ruling their own island and the territories they already controlled. They wanted more. They wanted to dominate the entire world, to bring all peoples under their authority. This growing ambition and moral decay sets the stage for what comes next in our story. But for now, as you rest in the quiet darkness of your own room, let us leave Atlantis at peace. Let us imagine it in its golden age before the fall, when its rings of water and land sparkled in the Mediterranean sun, when its people believed they had built something eternal. The city sleeps. The ocean around it is calm. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new glories, new steps along the path that leads, inexorably, toward catastrophe. But tonight, Atlantis dreams, and in those dreams perhaps it senses what is to come. Perhaps somewhere in the temple a priest wakes in the dark with an inexplicable feeling of dread. Perhaps somewhere in the palace a king stirs in his sleep, troubled by visions he cannot quite remember upon waking. Or perhaps not. Perhaps on this night, Atlantis simply rests, unaware, innocent, secure in its power and its wealth, not knowing that all of it, every palace and temple, every ship and bridge, every carefully carved ring of stone and water, will soon vanish beneath the waves, leaving behind only a story, a legend, a mystery that will haunt humanity for thousands of years to come. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The ancient city fades into the comfortable darkness, and sleep draws nearer with each passing moment. There comes a point in the story of every great civilization when something shifts, when the arc of history bends away from glory and toward decline. For Atlantis, this moment did not announce itself with thunder or prophetic warnings. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the slow erosion of a coastline by the relentless patience of the sea. Generation by generation, the character of the Atlantean people changed, and with it the destiny of their entire civilization. We return now to the story Plato tells, moving from the description of Atlantis in its prime to the account of its ambition and eventual destruction. The change in the Atlanteans, as Plato describes it, was fundamentally moral. In the beginning, they possessed what he calls true and great wisdom. They understood that virtue and friendship were more valuable than gold, that character mattered more than material possessions. They lived according to the laws that Poseidon had established, and they prospered not just materially but spiritually. But the divine portion in their nature, that spark of godhood inherited from their ancestor Poseidon, began to fade with each passing generation. As it grew weaker, human qualities grew stronger. Pride, greed, ambition, the desire for domination, all these began to take hold in the hearts of the Atlantean people. They looked around at their wealth, at their powerful navy, at their vast empire, and they began to believe that they deserved even more. They began to see themselves not as stewards of a great civilization, but as masters of the world, who could take whatever they wanted.
To those who could not see into the soul, Plato tells us, the Atlanteans still appeared glorious. They were rich, powerful, successful in all their endeavors. But to those with the wisdom to perceive deeper truths, it was clear that they had become corrupted, that they had abandoned the values that made them great. Zeus, the king of the gods, who sees all things, recognized what was happening. He saw that this noble race was becoming morally bankrupt, and he decided that they needed to be punished, to be brought back to their senses, so that they might become chastened and improved.
Zeus called together all the gods in his dwelling place at the center of the universe. He gathered them to announce his judgment on Atlantis, and here Plato's dialogue breaks off. The text of Critias ends abruptly, mid-sentence, never to be completed. We never learn what Zeus said to the assembled gods. We never hear the details of how the punishment was to be carried out. The manuscript simply stops, leaving us in eternal suspense, forever waiting for words that were never written, or that were written and then lost to time. But we know what happened. In the Timaeus, the dialogue that precedes Critias, Plato gives us the ending. After describing how ancient Athens resisted the Atlantean invasion, how the Athenians fought bravely to defend not just themselves but all the peoples threatened by Atlantean aggression, he tells us of the catastrophe. Earthquakes came, violent beyond measure, and in a single day and night of terrible destruction, the entire island of Atlantis sank into the sea. The Athenian warriors who had fought so nobly were also swallowed by the earth. Both victor and vanquished perished together in a catastrophe so complete that it left almost no trace. Let us imagine that final day, that last morning when the people of Atlantis woke not knowing it would be their last. The sun rises as it always has, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The fishermen go out in their boats, casting their nets into water that seems as calm as glass. The farmers walk out to their fields, checking the irrigation channels, examining their crops. The merchants open their shops. The children run through the streets. Everything appears normal, ordinary, safe. But perhaps there are signs for those who know how to read them. Perhaps the animals are restless, the dogs whining and pacing, the horses stamping nervously in their stables. Perhaps the birds that usually fill the air with their morning songs are strangely silent. Perhaps the water in the rings, usually so clear and calm, is slightly murky, disturbed by currents that seem to come from deep below. Perhaps some of the older priests, the ones most sensitive to the movements of the earth and sea, feel an uneasiness they cannot quite name, a sense that something is wrong, though they cannot say what. The day proceeds. The markets fill with people. Ships move in and out of the harbors. In the palace, the kings meet to discuss some matter of state, perhaps a new expedition to conquer more territory, perhaps negotiations with a distant trading partner. In the temple of Poseidon, priests perform the morning sacrifices, following rituals that have been performed the same way for centuries. The smell of incense and burning offerings fills the air. Prayers are chanted in ancient words whose meanings have become more sound than sense, repeated so often that they flow without thought. And then, perhaps around midday, when the sun is high and hot, it begins. A rumbling, deep and low, felt more than heard. It comes from beneath the earth, from some profound depth, where forces beyond human understanding stir and shift. The sound grows. The ground begins to tremble. At first it is slight, barely noticeable. People pause in their conversations, look around, exchange glances. Earthquakes are not unknown in this part of the world. They have happened before. They will pass. But this one does not pass. The trembling intensifies. Objects begin to fall from shelves, cracks appear in walls. The water in the ring sloshes violently, waves rising and crashing against the embankments. People stumble, struggling to keep their feet. Panic begins to spread. Parents grab their children. Merchants abandon their goods and run for open ground. The wealthy emerge from their palaces, their faces showing fear that wealth cannot protect them from. The shaking grows worse. Buildings begin to collapse. First the older ones, the poorly constructed ones, but then even the solid marble structures start to come apart. Columns snap like twigs. Roofs cave in with crashes that can be heard even over the roar of the earthquake itself. Dust rises in enormous clouds, turning the air brown and making it hard to breathe. People are screaming now, running without direction, trying to escape though there is nowhere to go. In the temple of Poseidon, the great statue of the god sways. The priests, who remained at their posts trying to calm the people with prayers, now flee as cracks race up the walls and pieces of the ivory ceiling begin to fall. The golden ornaments clatter to the floor. The oil lamps tip over, spilling fire that begins to spread. For a moment, through the smoke and dust, the statue seems to come alive, seems to look down with an expression of anger or perhaps sorrow at what is happening to the city built in its honor. The earthquake continues. It does not come in waves with periods of calm between. It is relentless, constant, each second bringing new destruction. The bridges that connect the rings collapse, dropping into the water below. The walls that were covered in brass and tin and precious orichalcum crumble and fall. The carefully engineered canals crack and drain or overflow and flood. The harbor installations are torn apart. Ships are dashed against the docks or against each other, splintering into debris. And then the sea begins to rise. Perhaps this is caused by the same forces that shake the earth, tectonic movements that displace vast quantities of water. Perhaps it is a tsunami generated by an earthquake centered somewhere offshore. Or perhaps, as the legend suggests, the island itself is sinking, the land dropping away into the depths, and the ocean is simply rushing in to fill the void. The water comes as a wall, higher than any building, moving faster than a person can run. Those near the coast see it first, a darkness on the horizon that grows and grows until it becomes clear what it is. By then, it is too late. The wave strikes with a force that obliterates everything in its path. Entire neighborhoods vanish in seconds. People are swept away, tumbled and drowned in the churning water. Ships are picked up and carried inland, smashing through whatever structures still stand. The wave rushes inward along the canals, following the pathways the Atlanteans so carefully constructed. It crashes against the rings, overtopping them, pouring into the spaces between. The carefully maintained separation of water and land disappears. Everything becomes chaos, a swirling mixture of water and debris and desperate drowning people. Some try to swim, but the current is too strong, the water too cold and violent. Some cling to floating wreckage, but the shaking earth sends more buildings collapsing into the flood, creating new dangers with each passing second. Some make it to high ground, to parts of the island that are still above water. But these sanctuaries are temporary. The land continues to sink. What was dry ground becomes shallow water, then deeper water, then ocean. In the palace, perhaps, a king stands at a window watching his civilization disappear. He sees the temple of Poseidon, that magnificent structure covered in precious metals, begin to tilt and then collapse into the rising water. He sees the carefully planned rings of his capital city disappearing beneath waves. He sees his ships, his navy that was the pride of the empire, being destroyed. And perhaps in that moment, he understands. He understands that all the wealth and power meant nothing. He understands that they had angered the gods through their pride and ambition. He understands that this is the end. The water reaches the palace. Windows shatter. Doors burst open. The flood pours through corridors that once echoed with power and authority. The king is swept away like any common person, like any slave or merchant or child.